the Madrid Terms of Reference, and the other related instruments. Mr. President, unfortunately, a report from the ground, as expounded by the Special Coordinator, indicated that the current situation in the Middle East contradicts the tenets of this resolution. This is a matter of great concern for us, as is for this entire Council. We note with concern that in addition to the catastrophic situation in Gaza, where there is a complete disregard for human dignity and international legal instruments on conflict, illegal settlement in the occupied territory continues. We are deeply concerned over the continued demolitions of local structures, leaving many people unprotected, with implications that undermine the efforts for peace in the region and the implementation of the two-state solution. The reiterated tensions and violence in the Gaza Strip must come to an end. This protracted conflict threatened to expand to other countries in the region, which could worsen the humanitarian crisis among refugees and displaced people. We call for the immediate de-escalation of this conflict and for the parties to exercise the maximum restraint and abide by the Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. Mr. President, Mozambique supports all diplomatic initiatives by the international community, the countries of the region, the United Nations, and the active and tireless involvement of this Council to find the best ways to bring a lasting peace in the region. As we have stated time and again, the only alternative to the conflict between Israel and Palestine lies in the solution of two independent and sovereign states that will be living side by side. We reiterate Mozambique's strong support for all initiatives aimed at bringing lasting peace and security in Palestine and in Israel. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. The situation in the occupied Palestinian territories remains dire. It is extremely troubling that since 7th October, over 500 Palestinians, including over 100 children, have been killed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. A large part have taken place during intensified operations by Israeli forces. Several casualties have resulted from settler violence. We stress that Israel, as the occupying power, must exercise maximum restraint. It must abide by its obligations under international law and protect the Palestinian population against all acts or threats of violence. Israeli illegal settlement expansion, demolition of Palestinian property, and forced evictions must cease. Settlements are illegal under international law. They constitute an obstacle to peace, threaten the viability of a two-state solution, and are pushing the West Bank to the precipice. Malta is also concerned at the figures of the grave violations reported in the Secretary-General's report on children and armed conflict. We hope that Israel will engage with the Secretary-General and with the wider UN to address the concerns referred to in the report. These include the verified detention of hundreds of Palestinian children from the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. we echo the Secretary General's call on Israel to resort to the use of detention only as a last resort for the shortest period and to prevent any violence or ill treatment of the detainees, in line with their obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also share his extreme concern regarding the escalating tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, which would provoke further devastation and human suffering in the region. President, Malta reiterates its firm conviction for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We also underline our repeated calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held since the heinous 7th October terror attacks. The ground offensive into Rafah has only exacerbated the dire humanitarian conditions and led to the further displacement of over 1 million civilians. The recently published reports by the OHCHR and the International Commission of Inquiry raised deeply alarming conclusions regarding the alleged commission of crimes under international law, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. All parties to the conflict have an obligation to respect the principles of international law, including international humanitarian law and its principles of necessity, distinction, proportionality, and humanity. Furthermore, the provision of humanitarian aid cannot be dependent on a ceasefire agreement or tactical pauses. Parties must ensure the unimpeded, safe delivery of humanitarian aid at scale into and across Gaza. The implementation of the relevant Security Council resolutions and the full, immediate, and effective implementation of the orders of the ICJ remains essential. President, de-escalation and the revival of a political horizon must remain a core priority. Key to this are efforts focusing on fiscally and politically reinforcing the Palestinian Authority for effective governance over both the West Bank and Gaza, and its inclusion in discussions of a recovery plan for Gaza. Regional and international backing to ensure the PA's stability and credibility is crucial. Recent Israeli actions, which threaten to undermine the Palestinian Authority's fiscal stability, undermine this and must be reversed. The international community must rally behind the credible and irreversible realization of the two-state solution. Pivotal to this are the fulfillment of Palestinian aspirations for statehood and assurances for Israel's security. To conclude, President, Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to a political solution based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states living side by side in peace and security, in line with all relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I too would like to thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. Mr. President, since the terrorist attack on Hamas on the 7th of October and the taking of hostages, which Slovenia continues to condemn, this Council has spent hours and days debating the situation in Gaza. At every meeting, members of this body called for ceasefire, for release of hostages, and for distribution of humanitarian aid. We also called for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We were united in arguing against military operation in Rafah. We unanimously voiced our concerns in several press elements and statements. Despite all differences and challenges, we have adopted 4 resolutions demanding a ceasefire, release of hostages, and humanitarian aid. Yet again, as we meet here today, we continue hearing the same accounts of situation in Gaza, accounts of desperation, destruction, hunger, and danger, with women and especially the children suffering the most. Not even a glimmer of hope, but more dead, more maimed, more traumatized Gazans. and hostages still being kept in the tunnels of Hamas for 9 months without any contact with their families or the ICRC. It seems that both Hamas and Israel continue to use civilians, Gazans, and hostages as instrument of pressure on the other side. But they are human beings exposed to horrific and inhuman treatment and suffering for long 9 months. Extreme hunger is still present in Gaza. Slovenia is deeply troubled by obstacles to delivery of humanitarian aid and basic services. We underline the prime responsibility of Israel as occupying power, in line with the 4th Geneva Convention, to ensure food and medical supplies for the population, not merely allowing its passage. Only the cessation of hostilities, in conjunction with sustained humanitarian access, can reduce the risk of famine. We are deeply concerned by persistent attacks on civilian and UN infrastructure, as well as on safe zones and humanitarian personnel. The attack near the ICRC office on Saturday and the strike on UNRWA aid distribution facility on Sunday prove yet again that this Council's arguments, concerns, demands, and decisions remain ignored. We were promised improvements in deconfliction mechanism. We were told safe zones will protect civilians. We were guaranteed investigations in incidents leading to massive casualties among civilians and humanitarian workers. We have seen little to nothing on all these promises. I believe that my delegation is not the only one deeply disturbed and frustrated. We expect our last resolution to be implemented by both sides, but a follow-up to its non-compliance will be needed soon. The Council must find a way to have it done and delivered. Mr. President, Slovenia is alarmed by the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, including the events that unfolded during the Flag March, the continuing movement restrictions in the West Bank, increase of the disproportionate use of force by Israeli security forces, and the number of raids. The abuses, such as the one in Jenin on Saturday, are unacceptable, and we note that IDF itself marked it as violation of orders and standard operating procedures. We remain concerned over advancement of settlement plans, demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures in front of our own eyes. We are deeply concerned about impunity of persistent settler violence affecting population in the West Bank and aid delivery to Gaza. Colleagues, assaults on the United Nations, its representatives and entities are an attack on what its membership created through decades of multilateral cooperation. We are concerned by the increasing challenges UNRWA is facing, and in this regard, we would like to invite member states to join the shared commitments on UNRWA as an expression of support to the agency and its mandate. Slovenia expresses its support to the government of the State of Palestine as it undertakes much-needed and anticipated reforms to regain trust of the Palestinians. We regret that the deteriorating fiscal situation of the Palestinian Authority is putting severe limitations to these endeavors, and we are deeply concerned over the decision of Israel to seize the Palestinian Authority tax revenues. On the 4th of June, Slovenia officially recognized the State of Palestine. Our recognition was a demonstration of our commitment to a two-state solution. We see it as the only guarantee of lasting peace and security for the State of Israel and the region, for Israelis and Palestinians. The road there can lead only through negotiations between two equal and sovereign entities. Mr. President, in recent months, we have often spoken about the danger of regional escalation, including in the Red Sea and between Israel and Iran. With war drums beating louder along the blue line, our fear of miscalculation is growing by the day. We call on both parties to show restraint, commit to full implementation of the Resolution 1701, and use UNIFIL liaison and coordination mechanisms. We welcome the efforts of France and the United States in offering their good offices. The Council should unanimously urge both parties to engage in these discussions and de-escalate. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Tor Vennesland, for the detailed briefing on the situation on the occupied Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of the Jordan River. For 9 months now, the Israeli operation in Gaza has been ongoing. In this time, more than 37,500 Palestinians have been killed. Most are women and children. The number of wounded has surpassed 86,000 people. There are tens of thousands of people who are missing. More than 1,500 Israelis and foreigners have also died, and 120 people continue to be held hostage. In the Strip, the civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and houses, have been almost completely destroyed. The statistics on the West Bank are appalling. Approximately 600 Palestinians have been killed. Approximately 130 are wounded. More than 5,000 have been wounded. The former are children. As a result of Israeli security raids over the past 24 hours, at least 20 Palestinians have been detained. According to the data from the Palestinian Commission on Detainee Affairs, since 7 October 2023 on the West Bank, 9,345 people were arrested. In parallel, on the occupied Palestinian lands, new Israeli settlements are continuing to be erected. Local residents are being evicted from their homes under the pretext of lacking permits issued by the occupying power. What appears horrifically cynical is the following situation. Palestinians are being forced to themselves demolish their homes in order not to have to pay the costly levies for this to the Israeli construction workers. The magnitude of violence by the radical Israeli settlers, as well as their complete impunity, are shocking. In response to the killing of a 14-year-old Israeli boy from Malachi Shalom, despite the fact that the alleged criminal was swiftly detained, angry mobs of settlers burned down 37 villages. They killed 4 people and wounded another 91 Palestinians. What is most horrific is the fact that this lawlessness was being perpetrated in full sight of the law enforcement officers. This all illustrates the vicious cycle of violence on the occupied Palestinian territory, which inevitably fuels radicalization on both sides. There is only one solution, namely to root out the culture of impunity and end the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. Turning to the operation in Rafah, all members of the Security Council talked about the unacceptability of this, and yet, alas, it is going forth full steam ahead. Resolution 2735 about some kind of a deal, the result of which should have been a ceasefire. Oh, this at least was what the U.S. authors alleged or proposed, is not working. What has been sold to the Council in the guise of a solution for saving Gaza, this kind of a cat in a sack, as we warned, turned out to be dead letter. What is even worse, in the resolution of the Security Council, a blatant lie crept in. There is it is explicitly stated therein that Israel consented to the peace proposal of the international mediators. However, in West Jerusalem, this has not yet been confirmed. They at the same time announcing the decisive intent to completely destroy Hamas. Ultimately, none of the phases stipulated in Resolution 2735 has been implemented. The Council essentially was blindly dragged into a misadventure and moved towards blessing a scheme which from the get-go had no chances of being implemented. We urge the membership of the Security Council moving forward to adopt a more conscientious approach to those decisions which they support and to give thought to their actual content. The bleakest scenarios regarding the consequences for civilians of the Rafah invasion were borne out. In an attempt to reach to the Hamas commanders, Israelis rained down indiscriminate strikes on refugee camps, and this resulted in heavy civilian casualties. We all recall the devastating IDF airstrike targeting Tal al-Sultan in Rafah on 26 May, when 45 Palestinians died at the same time. And only 2 days before then, the International Court of Justice handed down the third ruling on provisional measures with a demand for the Israelis to end the military operation in Rafah. This was another blatant demonstration of Israelis' egregious violation of Security Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, ICJ rulings, the norms of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions in its capacity as the occupying power. To this, we should add the unbearable living conditions of Palestinians who were evacuated from Rafah. They lack basic shelter and sanitary conditions. They lack access to medicine and drinking water. According to UNRWA, 69% of schools where displaced persons from Gaza sought shelter, 69% of those schools endured and continue to endure daily bombardments. We demand that Israel halt the operation in Rafah. We also call upon all parties to immediately, unconditionally cease fire, release hostages, and the detained Palestinians. Amid intense hostilities, what is absolutely impossible is to provide for safe and sustained access to those in need. Nor can the situation be remedied by what the senior coordinator of the UN Sigrid Kaag launched. I referred to the special humanitarian mechanism for Gaza. The main channel for delivery of assistance through the Rafah crossing and the Kerem Shalom crossing are both closed. Nor has what the Americans erected, the floating pier, nor have the hopes for this been realized. The transportation of cargo was halted against the backdrop of its destruction due to inclement weather. Now is the time, President, to consider how to preempt the recurrence of this escalation of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There's a need to launch a negotiations process on an equitable basis between the Palestinians and Israelis on the range of final status issues, the result of which will be the establishment of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel in accordance with the approved international legal rulings. We believe that the membership of Palestine at the United Nations would help bring this to fruition. In this context, we wish to applaud the decision of a host of Caribbean and European states to recognize the state of Palestine. Thereby, they acted to reaffirm a willingness to redress a historic injustice where one state was granted membership at the UN in 1948 and another state was denied this legitimate right for 3/4 of a century now. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing on the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. The report provides another grim picture of developments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and, sadly, highlights the ever-widening chasm between the legal obligations of the occupying power and the latter's compliance with those obligations. The Council must act urgently to stem this tide of impunity and to end the indignities that the Palestinian people are subjected to on a daily basis. Guyana is concerned that settlement activity continues unabated in the occupied West Bank in violation of Resolution 2334, and has noted that the occupying power recently made the largest declaration of state land in the occupied West Bank. These actions, coupled with the ongoing demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures, directly threaten the viability of the two-state solution, since they are a continuous encroachment on Palestinian territory while simultaneously displacing its lawful residents. We call on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. We underscore that the establishment of Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967 has no legal validity. The level of violence that accompanies the occupying power's illegal activities in the occupied Palestinian territory is distressing. We have seen, for example, recent reports of the Palestinian man who was strapped to the hood of a military vehicle and in his injured state driven around a neighborhood in the West Bank. What accounts for this level of barbarity by one people against another? It is the cultivation and perpetuation of an ideology that dehumanizes the other, thus making it possible to devise and execute all kinds of violent and oppressive acts against those seen as inferior. By continuing to promulgate this ideology, Israel remains a constant threat, not only to the well-being of Palestinians, but also to the values of the United Nations, of which it remains a member state. Guyana urges this Council to seriously consider how it might use the tools at its disposal to stop Israel's atrocities against the Palestinian people. On this latter note, Mr. President, the current situation in the Gaza Strip remains of deep concern to Guyana. We were hopeful that this Council's various resolutions, including Resolution 2735, supporting the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, would have yielded a ceasefire and the release of hostages and detained Palestinians, but this has not yet materialized. In the meantime, this man-made catastrophe has gotten worse, characterized by, inter alia, a record death toll, starvation, disease, destruction, and displacement. Amidst these realities, it appears that the Israeli Defense Force has incorporated a strategy of bombing refugee camps, where thousands of Palestinians are now living in extremely vulnerable conditions. This war must end now. We reiterate our calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, bringing an end to this hell where women and children bear the brunt of it. Guyana also stresses the importance of adequate humanitarian access into Gaza using all available routes, and calls on Israel to facilitate the entry of adequate goods into Gaza to meet the needs of the besieged and ailing population. This is the legal obligation of Israel. We, as member states of the United Nations and members of the UN Security Council, are duty-bound to ensure that justice and obligations under international law are upheld. Mr. President, allow me to reflect briefly on the provision contained in Resolution 2334 for all states to distinguish in the relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. Here, I would like to emphasize that greater due diligence must be exercised by all member states to ensure full adherence to this provision in all their commercial dealings with Israel. We cannot simultaneously condemn the illegality of settlements and engage in the trade of commodities produced in those illegal settlements. There must be consequences for those who flout their obligations in this regard. Let me conclude by once again emphasizing the urgency of halting the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory and ending the war in Gaza. We call on the parties to prioritize the lives of innocent civilians who continue to suffer with no end in sight. I call on this Council to prioritize accountability and to send a strong message of deterrence to those who hold the view that they can continue to kill and maim innocent civilians without consequences. Finally, I urge a redoubling of efforts to achieve the two-state solution. This is the just end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we must reevaluate our strategies for achieving it. Guyana remains committed to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I thank you for organizing this meeting, and my thanks also go to Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his briefing.
The situation in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory and the rising tensions along the Blue Line are alarming. This Council's attachment to ensuring that all parties respect international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights, is also in the interest of avoiding an even more serious regionalization of the conflict. In the West Bank, attacks, threats, and intimidation by Israeli settlers against the Palestinian population in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continue with virtual impunity. Switzerland condemns these attacks, in which the number of civilian victims was already reaching record levels before the 7th of October 2023 and has since increased significantly. These attacks must stop. Resolution 2334 calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror, provocation, and destruction. Allegations of disproportionate use of force and acts of violence against civilians must be investigated and those responsible brought to justice. Switzerland recalls Israel's obligations as an occupying power under international law, including the obligation to protect the civilian population. Switzerland also points out that the Israeli settlements are illegal under international humanitarian law and, according to Resolution 2334, constitute a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and the establishment of a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. Recurrent announcements by Israeli leaders and measures to expand them contribute to the escalation and must be stopped. Switzerland notes with concern recent Israeli decisions to transfer the management of settlers' civil affairs in the West Bank to the Israeli civil administration. In accordance with international humanitarian law, Israel must refrain from taking measures that would introduce permanent changes, in particular demographic and administrative changes, in the occupied territory. In Resolution 2730, this Council reaffirmed the responsibility of states and parties to the conflict to respect and protect the civilian population, including humanitarian personnel. Infrastructure and property used for humanitarian relief operations, as well as convoys, must also be respected and protected. This includes UNRWA premises, including in East Jerusalem, as well as ICRC premises. President, Resolution 2735 was adopted on the 10th of June, and Switzerland emphasised that it currently represents the best chance of ending the appalling conflict that has claimed tens of thousands of victims since Hamas's acts of terror on the 7th of October, which we strongly condemned. Despite the 4 resolutions adopted by this Council, hostilities in the Gaza Strip continue to expose hundreds of thousands of civilians, including a very large number of children, to danger, forced displacement, and an increased risk of starvation and famine. Similarly, dozens of hostages remain in captivity in Gaza. Switzerland reiterates its opposition to the current offensive in Rafah. It recalls the provisional measures ordered by the court, the International Court of Justice. These are binding, so Israel expects Israel to comply with them. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire to facilitate the safe, rapid and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid by all means into the Gaza Strip, and for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Those held captive in connection with the conflict must be able to be visited by the International Committee of the Red Cross and receive the assistance and protection to which they are entitled. Finally, this Council must continue to support the two-state solution, which is the only foundation capable of guaranteeing peace between Israelis and Palestinians and stability in the region. We must contribute to rebuilding, without further delay, this foundation of 2 democratic states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side, in peace, within secure and recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Mr. Wennesland for his briefing, and I wish to assure him of France's full support. With the adoption of Resolution 2735, the Security Council demanded that Hamas accept, as Israel did, the U.S. peace plan and urged both parties to fully implement the provisions thereof without delay and without any conditions. This resolution must finally be implemented pursuant to Article 25 of the United Nations Charter. France demands an immediate ceasefire and the release without delay of all hostages. We condemn the barbaric terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on 7 October 2023. France opposes the operation underway in Rafah, which resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of civilians. In line with the ruling of the ICJ, Israel has an obligation to immediately halt its military operation and any other action in the Rafah governorate. The delivery of assistance must not be obstructed and should benefit the civilian population. France calls for strict compliance with IHL. President, as the situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate, Israeli settlement activity is accelerating in the West Bank. France condemns this policy, which runs counter to international law and which imperils the prospect of achievement of a two-state solution. We will never recognize the illegal annexation of territory nor the legal recognition of illegal settlements. France condemns violence perpetrated by settlers. We deplore the forced displacements of Palestinian communities. We're determined to impose new sanctions against violent settlers. Tensions in recent weeks in Jerusalem are alarming. We call for the avoidance of any measure which may result in conflagration of the situation in Jerusalem and the West Bank. The historic status quo on the holy sites needs to be safeguarded. France and the European Union do not recognize Israeli sovereignty on the areas that came under Israeli administration after 5 June 1967. France, alongside partners, sees to it that there be compliance with international law, including compliance with Resolution 2334. The policy of distinction is geared towards enactment of the legal distinction between the territory of Israel, which is internationally recognized, and occupied territories. There is a need now, more than ever before, to lay the political foundation for the implementation of two-state solution, the only way to deliver peace and security to both Israelis and Palestinians. We reaffirm our commitment to Israeli security and to the establishment of a state for the Palestinians. We are proactively mobilized to that end alongside parties and together with international and regional partners. We support a reformed Palestinian Authority that is capable of exercising its authority throughout all the Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip. Israel must no longer obstruct the transfer of revenues to the Palestinian Authority. France is alarmed by the heightened regional tensions, which pose a risk of conflagration, particularly between Israel and Lebanon. We remain engaged in preventing any escalation along the blue line and engaged to the advancement of a diplomatic solution. We urge all stakeholders in the region to adopt a responsible approach. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Coordinator Winnisland for his briefing. The conflict in Gaza has been ongoing for over 8 months and caused unprecedented destruction and a humanitarian disaster. The international community has long since reached an overwhelming consensus. The GA, ESS, and the Security Council have adopted many resolutions calling for an immediate and durable ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and the removal of obstacles to humanitarian access and effective protection of the safety of the humanitarian workers. After announcing a 3-phase ceasefire proposal on May 31st, the U.S. spearheaded the adoption of Resolution 2735 by the Council, urging Israel and Hamas to accept and implement the proposal. At the time, the U.S. claimed that Israel already accepted the ceasefire proposal. Regrettably, until now, we haven't seen tangible signs from Israel of its agreement to a lasting ceasefire. On the contrary, we have witnessed its continued large-scale military operations and repeated attacks on refugee camps in Rafah, Nusrat, and Gaza City, again and again resulting in new and major casualties, and putting UNRWA, ICRC, and other humanitarian institutions in danger. There must be an immediate ceasefire, and once that is achieved, there should be no restart of the war. It is the core essence of the Council Resolution 2728 and 2735. To rescue hostages, creating more civilian casualties is not the way to go. China urges Israel to heed the resounding call of the international community for it to immediately cease military operations in Gaza and immediately stop the collective punishment of the Gazan population. We call on countries with important influence to bear on the parties to uphold an impartial position and make concrete and sincere efforts for the cessation of hostilities. Gaza is in the grip of a dire humanitarian situation, while Israeli military operations pose a grave threat to humanitarian workers. Its suggestion or even accusation of inaction on the part of humanitarian organizations is unacceptable. Under international humanitarian law, Israel has an obligation to protect the safety of humanitarian organizations and workers and to ensure the rapid entry of sufficient humanitarian goods into Gaza and their safe and orderly delivery to all people in need. In West Bank, searches, arrests, and raids by Israeli enforcement agencies against Palestinians are daily occurrences. We call on Israel to effectively curb violence against the Palestinian civilians and stop undermining the basis of governance for the Palestinian National Authority, including by expeditiously returning the withheld tax revenues. China reiterates that settlement activities are in violation of international law and the Council Resolution 2334 and erode the prospect for a two-state solution. Israel must immediately cease all settlement activities. President, as repercussions of the Gaza conflict spill over fast, we are seeing worrisome situations in the Red Sea and along the Lebanon-Israel border. China is gravely concerned about the reported Israeli plans of military offensives against Lebanon. As Secretary General Guterres cautioned last Friday, the situation in the Middle East is very precarious and can't afford for Lebanon to become another Gaza. China calls on all parties to exercise restraint and refrain from actions that could exacerbate tensions so as not to plunge the entire Middle East region into an even greater catastrophe. We call on the international community to take all necessary actions to bring about an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza, an early relaunch of the two-state solution, and the realization of enduring peace and security in the Middle East at an early date. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for your briefing. President, I'd like to highlight 3 areas since our last meeting. First, let me start by reaffirming the UK's commitment to the principles enshrined in Security Council Resolution 2334, which serves as a clear reinforcement of international support for a two-state solution. The suffering we have seen on and since the horrific attacks of the 7th of October underlines the importance, more than ever, of a diplomatic solution to this conflict, which guarantees the safety and security of both the Israeli and Palestinian people. We call for the immediate release of all the remaining hostages, including the return of those who have died in captivity. And we are appalled by reports of sexual violence and abuse. The UK stands firm in its condemnation of these heinous acts. The best way to get the hostages out is to get a deal done. We also urge Israel to let humanitarian aid enter Gaza through all crossing points immediately and guarantee deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work. We echo the Secretary-General's tribute to UN workers who have tragically lost their lives in this conflict, and we call upon Israel to ensure the protection of UN facilities and staff. The integrity of the UN and its ability to operate is paramount. It serves as a crucial lifeline for the many innocent civilians affected by this conflict. Second, the UK remains deeply concerned by the indiscriminate firing of rockets towards Israeli population centres, as noted in the Secretary-General's report. This must stop. We also note with concern the continuing construction of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. We are clear. These settlements are illegal under international law. We reiterate our call on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities. We condemn the human rights abuses and incitement of violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, where the UK has taken action in the form of sanctions against a number of those individuals and groups responsible. We're also deeply concerned by Israel's suspension of revenue transfers to the Palestinian Authority and the risks to correspondent banking relations. Such measures harm chances for peace, security, and stability. Finally, Mr. President, as the UK has said throughout, a negotiated pause in the fighting that leads to a sustainable ceasefire without a return to fighting is the best way to secure the release of the hostages, enable a significant scaling up of much-needed humanitarian aid, and lead to a permanent settlement of this issue. There is now a deal on the table, endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735, to achieve those goals. The onus is on Hamas to accept it and end the suffering of the Palestinian people and the remaining hostages. We must then work towards a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security for both nations and the wider region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, I am grateful to Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his briefing this morning and the Secretariat for the report. Ecuador appreciates and supports the work of the United Nations and its agencies. The Security Council has once again received and heard reports with growing figures for deaths, injuries and displaced persons, and which bear witness to the constant deterioration of the living conditions for the population of Gaza. Restrictions upon humanitarian operations continue. The Secretary-General reports that in May,